From the beginning of the Second World War, Johnson's faith in the Soviet Union would be repeatedly tested, first by the announcement of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. While Johnson himself despised fascism and so considered Hitler a firm enemy, he defended Stalin's choice to form an alliance, arguing that Russia was justified in leaving the West to fight its own war. His next test of faith would come in the form of the Soviet Union's invasion of Finland in November 1939. This time, Johnson could not defend Stalin's actions, and he would write in the New Statesman that, while he understood the desire of the Soviet Union to secure its borders, the invasion was totally immoral. It was in the midst of the war that Hewlett and Noel's children would be born. Their first daughter, Keziah, was born in 1940, and their second, Keren, in 1942. Sadly, Hewletts would be with them for very little of their early childhoods, as they left Canterbury with their mother to stay in Wales during the Blitz, while Hewlett stayed in Canterbury and with its community throughout the war.
Hewlett Johnson remained in Canterbury and indeed in the deanery throughout the difficult war years. His wife and children lived for most of the time in Wales, and there is a lot of correspondence between Hewlett and his wife Noel.
During the war, we were in North Wales because there was always a possibility that if there had been an invasion, Hewlett would have been on the blacklist, and he was very keen to send my mother away out of danger. So in 1940, she took me to North Wales, and my sister was born there 2 years later. So for the next 4 or 5 years, we saw very little of Hewlett. And the sad thing is that we never saw him at Christmas, Easter, or birthdays.
Now, Canterbury was very badly damaged through the Blitz, through the bombings, targeted bombings in 1942 or from 1942 onwards. And the deanery itself was extremely badly damaged with much of the front blown off. Hewlett Johnson experienced all of that firsthand with the community of Canterbury, and I think that endeared the community and the city of Canterbury very much to him.
I mean, his popularity, I think, came from the fact that he stood as the Dean of Canterbury, not the Red Dean of Canterbury, if that makes sense. Especially there are some fantastic photographs just show him helping out in the sense of sitting there with a cup of tea, but surveying the destruction of the Baedeker Blitz. And that's what Canterbury really needed. It needed its spiritual connection. There are so many crazy stories about what the cathedral was doing in World War II, when the Luftwaffe were trying to drop bombs to destroy deliberately the heart and mind of Canterbury. We've got to remember that's what the Baedeker Blitz was about, as opposed to, say, the London Blitz or Coventry, etc. It was Hitler to destroy the hearts and minds of England. And Canterbury picked because of its cultural and religious relevance, and the Dean kind of just personified that for people. And the fact that he was able to give them this strong spiritual leadership throughout the time, that's what I think made him popular.
For the cathedral itself, he made some quite daring decisions. He ordered that monuments be protected with sandbags, and he ordered that quantities of earth be brought into the nave. And many thought that was some sort of desecration of the building, but it almost certainly protected the inside of the building from the results of bombing. The roof of the cathedral was also painted green, and there was a team of fire watchers working under Hewlett Johnson to throw firebombs off the roof. So he did have a central role, really, in the survival of the cathedral's structure from the bombing of the wars.
In 1942, Cosmo Gordon Lang's term as Archbishop came to an end, and he was succeeded by William Temple, the Christian socialist who had recommended Johnson for the position of Dean in 1931.
William Temple was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury in 1942 and was enthroned here in a really moving and fairly splendid service in the midst of those World War II years with Hewlett Johnson as Dean. So William Temple had been Bishop of Manchester And as bishop, he had overseen, if you like, the appointment of Hewlett Johnson as Dean of Manchester. So they had a lot of shared experience. They had quite a lot in common. Their familiarity with Manchester, but also both men had an interest in social justice, had a leaning towards the left.
Temple and Hewlett Johnson formed a very, very powerful axis because they shared exactly the same view of Christian socialism. And the feeling in the Church of England was that once this blessed war is over, Temple and Johnson, between them, are going to forge a sort of new Jerusalem. And of course, the whole political scenery was going that way, the Beveridge Report, foundation of the welfare state, the National Health Service. It was all flowing in that sort of collectivist socialist direction.
Air, light, land and water. These exist before man's labour is expended upon them. And upon air and light, man can do next to nothing except spoil them. I suppose if it were possible to establish property rights in air, somebody would have done it before now. And then he would demand of us that we should pay him if we wanted to breathe what he would call his air. Well, it couldn't be done, so it hasn't been done. But it could be done with land, and it has been done with land. And as it seems to me, we have been far too tender towards the claims that have been made by the owners of land and of water as compared with the interests of the public who need that land and water for the ordinary purposes of human life.
Unfortunately, Temple's time as Archbishop would be cut short when, in October of 1944, he died unexpectedly of a heart attack at the age of 63.
Their relationship was good, but sadly William Temple died after only 2 years in office, and he died in 1944, so that relationship never flourished, if you like.
After the Soviet Union joined the war in 1941, Johnson and Da'ai would champion them as an ally to the West, forming the Joint Committee for Soviet Aid and working together with the Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund to assist the Soviet war effort. In 1945, as the war was nearing its end, William Temple would be succeeded as Archbishop by Geoffrey Fisher. Unlike his predecessor, Fisher couldn't tolerate Johnson's political views, and the two often struggled to work together.
William Temple died suddenly in 1944, and Geoffrey Fisher became Archbishop. And Fisher couldn't abide Hewlett Johnson. He hated the man and did his level best to get rid of him, and never succeeded. But Johnson and Geoffrey Fisher were absolutely at loggerheads pretty well for the whole of Johnson's time as Dean.
He did not get on well with Geoffrey Fisher, but there were an awful lot of people who didn't get on well with Geoffrey Fisher. It was extremely controversial. Utterly, I am right and the rest of the world is wrong.
Unfortunately, the relations between Fisher and Hewlett Johnson weren't as good, and they came in the post-war years when the country, the cathedral, was recovering. They came also at a time of increased tension between the canons and the dean. So, alas, that wasn't a particularly happy relationship then between Archbishop and dean.
Fisher hated Hewlett Johnson. He hated Johnson's politics. He hated the fact that the Dean of Canterbury was on personal terms with the communist leaders of the world, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai. Fisher felt that Johnson was demeaning the Christian gospel by preaching communism from the pulpit of Canterbury Cathedral. In terms of personality, in terms of politics, in terms of their theology, they were poles apart.
As the war ended in Europe, Johnson and Da'ai travelled to Moscow to present the Soviets with the money raised by the Red Cross Fund and to tour the country. Their visit would be interrupted when, in response to an urgent invitation, they travelled to Poland to join an international commission investigating Nazi crimes. It was here that Johnson and Da'ai would become among the first British witnesses to the extermination camps at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Upon their return to Russia, Johnson and Da'ai met with Premier Joseph Stalin and Foreign Minister Molotov, to whom Johnson took an immediate liking. From their meeting, Johnson felt that Stalin sincerely wanted friendship with the West and that he believed in its possibility. While in Russia, Johnson also met with the Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, Alexei I, from whom he received the gift of a bejeweled crucifix, which he would wear on all future public occasions. The two remained good friends, and Johnson would visit Alexei on the celebration of his 80th birthday. From Russia, Johnson and Da'ai embarked on a tour of the soon-to-be Eastern Bloc, as well as the disparate regions of the Soviet Union. They met with the Imam at Tashkent, toured factories in Uzbekistan, and spoke with politicians in Czechoslovakia, before returning to the UK in the last week of July 1945. Upon his return to the UK, Johnson was immediately greeted with suspicion from both the press and the cathedral chapter, as the seeds of the Cold War began to sprout.
Hewlett-Johnson travelled widely and was well received in his travels, but back home some of this was deemed to be inappropriate for a senior churchman of his status, so it didn't win him quite so many friends back home.
The Cold War would firmly cement Johnson's political allegiances and dedication to Soviet communism, at a time when many other Western leftists would move to distance themselves from the Soviet regime. Critics of Johnson now began to emerge from the left as well as the right. The prolific painter and anarchist Augustus John once said of Johnson that he would find more Christianity in Kropotkin, Tolstoy and Berdyaev than in Marx and Lenin. Unshaken by his critics, Johnson would continue to champion the Soviet Union internationally, visiting the United States and Canada in the autumn of 1945. He spoke to crowds at Madison Square Gardens in Chicago, Boston, Toronto and Montreal.
Some of the highlights are certainly when he's packing out places like New York stadiums, just on discussions of socialist theory. I mean, it's something, again, we wouldn't kind of think of. America post-Second Red Scare, post-McCarthy, when we were told that just uttering the word Russia gets you locked up, and yet here he is, clear evidence, people are willing to listen to him, they find him interesting, they find him engaging. I mean, there is that kind of humbug thing about him, isn't there, with the showman spirit, and he's got that. He knows how to pack out an audience.
I think what interests me most about that is, well, in part, the numbers. I think when you've got like sort of 10,000 people attending this most prestigious venue in New York, in the land of the free, because we often assume that socialism wasn't that well received. But clearly, you know, that there was an appetite, there was a functioning Communist Party, certainly a Socialist Party if we go further back under the likes of the famous Hoosier Eugene Debs. So it speaks to that there is a cohort within America that has very much sympathies with the left.
During his visit, Johnson stayed at the home of former Vice President Henry Wallace, who, less than a year later, would be fired from his position as Secretary of Commerce for urging cooperation with the Soviet Union. While in America, Johnson held interviews with the Mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, as well as the President of the United States, Harry Truman.
But that's the way, isn't it, that sometimes celebrity goes through a period when it gets completely forgotten. And then suddenly people say, good heavens, there was this really exceptional man. After all, in 1 year, he had a personal conversation with Stalin and a personal conversation with the President of the United States in the same period of a few months. And he was the only person in the world, really, who did that.
Johnson would attempt to visit the US for a second time in 1948, but by this time the Cold War was in full swing, and he was denied a visa due to his advocacy for the Soviet Union. This censorship would not go unchallenged, however, and a petition for Johnson to be allowed into the country, signed by many of America's notable writers, churchmen and rabbi, was presented to the White House, and he was eventually permitted to visit. Johnson would once again speak at Madison Square Gardens, this time alongside singer, actor and civil rights activist Paul Robeson, as well as Pan-Africanist W.E.B. Du Bois, and Henry Wallace, who by now had formed the Progressive Party and was running for president as its candidate.
But I think what amazed me was at times seeing photos of others that he was with, and so far nobody particularly seems to have picked up on this. people were aware that he knew Paul Robeson, who famously fell foul of HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, who were red baiting in the 1950s in that McCarthyite period. And Robeson, I think he had his passport taken from him, etc., and life was made very, very difficult for him. And he was this literally towering figure within the civil rights movement too. But I'd noticed some commentators had picked up on Robeson, but I managed to identify in the archives in terms of photos one of the most famous Pan-Africanists, and that was W.E.B. Du Bois, who famously established via the Niagara movement in the turn of the 19th century and early 20th century the very famous National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, the NAACP. And it's that organisation that was instrumental in the famous Brown ruling in the 1950s that ended Jim Crow segregation in school. But this figure then, Du Bois, he became somewhat frustrated, I think, with the NAACP, and he gravitated, like many civil rights activists did, and this again is often an untold story, but became communists because the communists would lend them support and because they started to see how capital was seemingly complicit in the exploitation of black Americans. And the fact that we can see pictures of Hewlett Johnson, his typical beaming smile, hand extended, greeting W.E.B. Du Bois. And of course, it's at a point in history when, we still presided over empire, and even past this point where we're going to be castrating Mau Mau guerrilla in Kenyan concentration camps. So as much as we often denigrate and critique the Dean because he's this apologist for Stalinism, we must remember that he's incredibly progressive on certain issues, and that was testament to it, that he would share platforms with these icons of the civil rights movement.
Johnson's visits to America were only the beginning of his travels during the Cold War, and he would go on to visit numerous countries all around the world to spread the gospel of Soviet communism. In 1948, Johnson would visit Poland to attend the World Congress of Intellectuals. In 1949, he travelled to Italy and attended the World Peace Council meeting in Rome, meeting with Pablo Picasso and spending an afternoon with the grandniece of Russian author Leo Tolstoy. In 1950, Johnson visited Australia and gave speeches advocating for peace between the East and West. Initially, he had planned to travel to New Zealand and speak there after his visit to Australia. But as tensions in the Cold War rose, governments became increasingly concerned about the spread of communism, and the US blocked Johnson's travel to New Zealand. Later that year, Johnson would again visit Canada, but found that his reception was mixed compared to his last visit in 1945, as the fighting of the Cold War became even more popular in the West and anti-communist sentiment grew. Afterwards, Johnson attended another World Peace Conference. While the conference was originally planned to be held in Sheffield, so many of the planned attendees' visas had been denied by the UK that the conference had to be moved to Poland. Later that year, it was announced that Johnson would be among the first recipients of the Stalin International Peace Prize, a Soviet counterpart to the Nobel Peace Prize, and he flew to Moscow to accept the award. After receiving the award, Johnson embarked on yet another fact-finding expedition in the Eastern Bloc, in search of evidence to counter Western propaganda. While he concluded that conditions were good, his visits were closely guided, and his investigations often surface level. In 1952, Johnson, accompanied by Nolan Da'ai, would travel to China at the invitation of the Communist Party and speak personally with Chairman Mao Zedong and Premier Zhou Enlai.
I know that he was invited, I think it was sort of every other summer, so I imagine that the invitation was extended. It wasn't just a sort of one-off. Now, we think he dined, didn't he, with Mao and met him, but it was more his relationship with Zhou Enlai, who was sort of the second most important figure in communist China. And I think it sounds as though that was quite a close relationship, that they were spending significant amount of time together, which I think just amazes me. As I've said, he wasn't really spending time with or with Stalin, and he wasn't particularly spending much time with Mao. Amazing that he met these historical characters, but it strikes me that he had deeper relationship with Chow and Lei. And as I'm saying this, it makes me realise perhaps seeing what the Chinese have on Hewlett-Johnson might be revealing, see what they have on file, and could tell us about that relationship, because it's quite something to spend your sort of summers and to be invited to one of the most potent and powerful men on the planet. What was going on there? What was that relationship?
He thought they were marvellous. Again, unfortunately, uncritical of them. And really, that was, he used to say sort of, Mao Zedong said this, and Stalin said that. In a way, particularly as a teenager, I rather began to distance myself from it. I think, feeling I didn't have enough information to be able to talk intelligently on it. And we didn't really get very much information from him or from Dai or the other people.
A far cry from the country he had visited in 1931, Johnson saw the CCP's stabilisation of the nation's economy, as well as its repairing of transport infrastructure, as proof of socialism's overwhelming success. During his stay, Johnson was informed by Chinese officials that the US Army had been carrying out germ warfare in Korea, dropping insects from planes carrying smallpox, cholera, meningitis and plague, which had supposedly spread through the North Korean encampments and infected their soldiers. Johnson met with several witnesses and was convinced of the truthfulness of their accounts.
Well, it certainly caused us a lot of consternation when we first discovered it in the archives, because we found sort of envelopes with the word confidential on, and then inside these confidential envelopes were testimony from US airmen detailing how they'd been tasked with dropping locusts and other insects to be used as vectors to spread all manner of contagion and viruses, which sort of worried us initially to wonder, because I studied a little bit of things like the war in Korea, and I wasn't really familiar with that narrative at all.
I mean, I can remember the excitement of actually coming across these original documents, these eyewitness accounts from American pilots that said, look, I can guarantee you there was germ warfare because we're the ones that dropped the insects, we're the ones that dropped the creatures to spread the diseases. And so when we first came across it, it was kind of alarming of what have we just come across here? And this is an eyewitness account, this is first-hand, this is not a fabrication, this is written, sent to the Dean. This isn't something he's picked up. This American Air Forceman wrote to the Dean on it. And it led us down this path of just becoming a little bit obsessed for about a good month, I think, investigating this, which led us to the House of Lords attacks on him. And it's only then when it kind of teases out, okay, there's much more going on perhaps here than we thought.
It turned out, and we discovered that these airmen had been held under duress by the Chinese and North Koreans, and then of course it dawned on us that these might well be fabricated confessions. Now, to be fair, I haven't explored it still yet in greater detail, other than that I'm aware that the airmen, I believe, retracted that statement and did actually admit to deploying biological weapons. And of course, with hindsight, we're well aware, aren't we, that this is more than possible. As much as there was outcry that it was outlandish to accuse the UN, US and the UK of using biological weapons, we know that they were doing this, and particularly using chemical weapons in the war in Indochina in the 1960s. And using them against civilian targets. And of course, we also know that the British, when we get to the 1990s, were willing to arm Saddam Hussein and facilitate his deployment of chemical weapons. So it's certainly not above and beyond the realms of possibility that happened.
He was very convinced about it, as was one of the top scientists at the time, Joseph Needham. And I think it was one of those things that, it's like the fake news. Well, What do you believe?
Convinced of these accusations, Johnson returned to the UK and immediately published his findings. The allegations were quickly met with outrage from politicians and the press, and Archbishop Fisher called for Johnson to be dismissed from his position as dean on the grounds of treason. Fisher brought this issue before the House of Lords, and the day was dedicated to discussing what action could be taken against him.
In 1952, in a debate in the House of Lords, Fisher described Johnson as blind, unreasonable and stupid. That's an extraordinary thing for an archbishop to say of the Premier Dean of England.
I think it's quite telling again, though, that the hysteria amongst the Lords, that they were willing to give over a day to sort of debating the treasonous actions, because they felt it was treason even to accuse the UK, US, etc. and the UN of participating in atrocities, as if we were beyond reproach. And I think, I personally, as I'm sure did he, find that hypocrisy gobsmacking and jaw-dropping, that they were willing to ruin a man's career.
When you see the almost violent attack made by the House of Lords on him, with the accusations of treason and trying to have him impeached and chucked out of the church, it shows you just how far they're willing to go to shut him up and to vilify him. And I think that's one of the real shames, that his legacy ends in vilification from the top. Vilification for asking questions, vilification for trying to hold governments to account. Now, I'm not saying that the British or American government did any of this, before I get a knock at the door from the security services. But it's dangerous that he's silenced. It's dangerous that they turn him into an enemy. And in the day in which we live in, where we have governments like Putin's locking people up for criticising the government as a crime, was the British government any different, dare I say? Was the House of Lords acting any more generously and mercifully than modern despots? No.
Well, maybe that actually speaks to some other truth. Maybe there was a reason that they were getting so hot under the collar, maybe because they might have been aware that there was some truth to it, and they wanted to absolutely crush, didn't they, any investigation into it. If you could effectively do someone for treason just for making the accusation, it's certainly going to put off any further or deeper investigation, isn't it?
Fisher argued fiercely for Johnson's dismissal, but while many of the Lords agreed with his accusations, they could make no legal case to convict Johnson of treason, and so he remained in his position. During the discussion, Earl Jowett compared the prospect of convicting Johnson of treason to the assassination of Thomas Becket, commenting that if we were to get rid of this turbulent priest, as in years past they had tried to get rid of a turbulent priest, we might have even greater trouble.
In the parallels between Thomas Becket and Hewlett Johnson just stood out straight away. I mean, it's the fact that in the House of Lords records you have the line, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" And you kind of think, okay, yeah, but the parallels again with Becket are there. And it's something touched upon but not really investigated.
Even if there was that scope or possibility again that he'd been used as something of a patsy. I think we know one of the chief biologists investigating, some Oxford professor, certainly had communist sympathies. But we also know that the Allies had access to all of the Japanese biological and chemical weapons at the end of World War II. And knowing, of course, what the West has committed in terms of atrocities elsewhere, it seems more than possible that he was right.
Although Johnson was not forced to resign from the office of Dean, his accusations, combined with his vocal advocacy for communist regimes internationally, had turned the chapter of the cathedral and the British press firmly against him.
The situation back home at the cathedral did become fairly impossible, with the Dean having so few friends amongst the canons. So he did remain Dean of Canterbury into the 60s, but the latter years of his deanship weren't particularly happy ones, unfortunately, for him or perhaps even for the institution, because the relations had become so strained.
Tensions would only rise higher when, in 1956, Malenkov was given a guided tour of Canterbury Cathedral by Johnson during a visit to the UK. When Fisher crossed paths with Malenkov in the cloisters, Fisher was outraged and wrote to Johnson expressing his contempt that the former Premier of the Soviet Union should be welcomed as a guest in Canterbury Cathedral. Later that year, Johnson would again visit China, this time as a sightseeing trip, on which he and Noel brought their daughters Keziah and Karen, and they would again visit Mao and Chow En-lay.
We were very much guests of the government. There was some really nice sightseeing, but some of it was going to, somewhere like a collective farm or a kindergarten. The trips are very much organised for Hewlett to see and to give him propaganda, again, to take back.
The fact that he goes on so many of these trips abroad for what are, he would maybe call them kind of truth-seeking missions, but he always takes his family with him. Whether it's shaking the hands of Castro to surveying communist China, his family are there, his daughter's there. The fact that they get to see that world with him, I think speaks a lot that he wants to share it with them.
The part I didn't like were when all the weapons and the tanks and all these guns and all the military stuff went past more and more and more. I really didn't like that. But that's how they did it. Mao Zedong, I simply remember shaking his hand, being introduced to him, but that was about it. Conversations weren't easy, and at some of the big banquets that we attended, which would go on for 2 or 3 hours, my sister and I would be sort of sat down at one end, and the top people would be talking with interpreters at the other.
Early in 1956, Johnson would publish another book called Christians and Communism. The book attempted to further his ideas of Christian socialism and expressed not only that the two are compatible, but that a good Christian should necessarily be a socialist.
It struck me as not, the best attempt to conflate the two. I mean, he comes up and draws out some interesting points about the correlation and connection between that particular theology and ideology. But he didn't strike me as the sort of greatest Marxist theorist. And once again, I would have thought Vox and perhaps De Eye again were helping him pen it. It didn't look to be the most detailed and exhaustive work, and I think I was a bit surprised that it didn't really seem to get to the heart of the matter.
And this one is just obviously this idea of him talking to God, trying to work out, is the Holy Bible and the Manifesto actually the same thing? If you just excuse the horrible caricature of a deity for a moment. It's just, again, but the idea is he's very firm. Yes, they're clearly this, and I try to draw the Christian God as the bemused character. I'm not quite sure if these are the same thing.
But I can see how he reconciles it with communism, because, we know it's there, isn't it, in the Bible, that revulsion directed towards the rich, that rejection of materialism, that very much comes through, doesn't it, the Bible? Or the stories about the Good Samaritan and attitudes towards, ethnic and racial minorities, or Jesus's attitude at times presented in the Bible towards women. We can see those kind of progressive politics that many people would associate with communism and Marxism. So I don't think it's a tall order at all. Because we live in quite interesting times since the economic crisis of 2008, we've seen a kind of revitalisation of radical politics, and particularly from the right. And the right seems to, and I guess always has for quite some time, owned Christianity. And of course that in part relates to Marxism, or at least Marxism's hostility towards it in the Soviet Empire and beyond. And yet it always struck me that there was a lot of crossover between the gospel and between Karl Marx's ideas. So I think it seemed very germane and of the now, and part of, I guess, our zeitgeist, that there was some kind of battle perhaps that could be fought over almost the soul of Christianity. And it strikes me that it might be a way to get people interested again in leftist politics, if they can see, as I said, in the Gospel and the New Testament, a figure that sounds like some kind of proto-communist. He seems to prefigure communism.
That same year, the new premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, gave a speech at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, denouncing Stalin's leadership, and would go on to implement a policy of de-Stalinization in an attempt to undo the effects of Stalin's regime. While many advocates of the Soviet Union would take this opportunity to denounce Stalin, Johnson continued to defend him, believing in his greatness as a leader for the rest of his life.
I think the thing to take into account, though, as well, is, of course, his age, particularly by 1956, that, you know, he is rapidly approaching his 80s. And, of course, I would have thought it would be heartbreaking or nigh on impossible to almost admit that your life's work or life's project, or that you'd wasted all that time supporting this ultimately monstrous regime. I imagine that would have been very hard to face. And particularly since we know he's a man of faith in terms of his Christianity, imagine it's almost an issue of faith with his support for the Soviet Union, and faith something that's quite tough to break, isn't it?
One of his problems, in a way, was that he didn't share doubts. I think that he had very fixed views, and I think at times it would have been a good thing if he could have perhaps said to himself, I could be wrong. But that was him. He didn't.
But yeah, it's on this point of hypocrisy, isn't it? I guess I've never understood why, well, I do understand in part why there's such a thing as a Stalinist apologist. You know, and rightly so, we should be very critical of anyone who supports that monstrous regime. But we don't have an equivalent for it, other than perhaps, you know, we might talk about apologists for empire. But we forget, don't we, when we sit and judge those that supported the Soviet Union, that, you know, the likes of a Churchill is responsible for literally millions of deaths in, for example, the Bengal famine. Or his brutal treatment of the Irish and their pursuit of independence, or his crushing of the general strike and sending the tanks into Liverpool and Glasgow, or for that matter any American president who we know are all culpable for, you know, invasions in Dominican Republic, or for overthrowing democratically elected regimes in Iran in the 1950s, or in Brazil in the 1960s. That they constantly commit the most grotesque crimes against humanity. And yet again, you know, these people are often lionized and hero worshipped. I just find it odd, or there's this huge double standard, isn't there, that we critique Hewlett, and rightly so, but why we don't do the same for these other apologists for the crimes of, you know, colonialism. You know, everyone who was voting for governments in the UK throughout the 19th and 20th century were knowingly voting for governments that maintained empire, which is obviously profoundly undemocratic, and more than that, often involved the slaughter and butchery of Aboriginals or Indians in uprisings, or as I mentioned, the Mau Mau, or whoever it might have been. So I don't see why we all get a pass on our crimes against humanity, and yet Hewlett doesn't for his tentative support for the Soviet Union.
In 1956, Johnson defended the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary in response to the Hungarian Revolution. Johnson maintained the Soviet line that Imre Nagy was a fascist whom Khrushchev was forced to depose. This once again sparked outrage from the press and chapter. Shirley banned the students of King's from speaking with Johnson, and he was excluded from governor meetings for some time after, at Fisher's request.
And Western opinion was absolutely outraged. Everything closed ranks against Russia. And here was Hewlett Johnson preaching Russian virtue.
I imagine he would have bought the propaganda, Soviet propaganda, that, you know, this was something being inspired by imperialists, and that this was a plot. And that he wouldn't have necessarily understood that it was in part done in the spirit of liberty, and that, you know, there was possibility of a different type of socialism.
But coincidental with the 1956 invasion of Russia, almost on the same day, was the Suez fiasco, when Britain and France and Israel were concocting a false story to justify an invasion of Egypt. And because it was a Britain, France and Israel, Johnson said, this is outrageous, this is old-fashioned imperialism. So people said, well, what's the difference between Britain, France and Israel invading Egypt to liberate the Suez Canal from Nasser and the Russians rolling their tanks into Budapest? And Hewlett-Johnson went into an enormously convoluted sort of moral exercise to maintain his position of justifying the one and condemning the other.
And of course, it's at a point where pretty much everyone on the left, that is the turning point, isn't it, 56, where we start developing neo-Marxism and the new left, and there's this desperate desire to try to distance socialism and Marxism from Stalin's project. And rightly so, because we know Marx's intentions were humanist, and Stalin produces a regime that is the complete opposite of one that has humanism at its core. It is a totalitarian regime that only seemed to serve, his interests and a small cadre of the party elite. So 56 is a watershed moment, and arguably, like all other either fellow travellers or Marxist intellectuals, he should have distanced himself. But in his 70s, that seemed a bridge too far.
Later in his career, Hewlett and Noel campaigned for the furthering of women's rights in the UK as well as internationally, and Noel herself headed the National Association of Women.
And my father was absolutely all for women's rights. That's right. One of the things that came up later on with the Sunday evening choir, the choir school. They did the Sunday evening choir, but the lay clerks who were employed for services by the cathedral, they didn't do the Sunday evening one. And there were a number of voluntary people who came in who sang, adults. And Hewlett very much wanted the women to be able to wear surplices like the men and like the choristers. And that was one of the battles he lost. He tried very hard because he felt that, they were doing the same job. They should have the same uniform, as it were. But he lost that one. I think he would have been absolutely delighted when we heard that the Langton girls were singing in the choir these days, because that was something that he felt very strongly about.
Johnson would also campaign for nuclear disarmament, speaking against the proliferation of nuclear weapons to the British Peace Committee in 1960. Johnson and his family would attend a number of anti-nuclear demonstrations, and he himself would hang a sign over the deanery which read, "Christians, ban nuclear weapons." In response, the students of the King's School would hang their own sign, which read, "Kings, ban communists."
One of the things that gets him in trouble with the King's School is his attack against nuclear bombs. Stop the Atom bomb is one of his big campaigns. And at the time when I was drawing this, it was towards the ends of Trump's administration, and it just so happened to be at a time when Trump was talking about rearming America. So for me, the morality Trump stupidity just seemed an easy punt to bring it to light, and also show that some of the messages that Hewlett had are still relevant today.
Well, I was impressed that he seemed to be a leading light in it, and although he's not directly connected to the campaign for nuclear disarmament, he's very much there in that milieu. Again, he's something of a patsy, I think, for the Soviets. I think they were into the idea of nuclear power, as in a means to produce energy, and he was quite smitten and taken by scientific solutions to engineering problems in part. But I think he's ahead of the game, and of course he's conscious, and rightly so, that it's only been the West that have ever used these terrible weapons, and of course he would have been more familiar with the discourse that they weren't really necessary. That if you look at records of the use of those terrifying weapons by governments, again, that many people voted for and supported in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that the Japanese were in the process of negotiating peace. They did not need to be used, and we know that Truman and the Allies used them gleefully because They know the impact it will have on the Soviet Union and the burgeoning communist movement in China. This was a way to make them snap to attention that the West had the upper hand now. So, I see him as progressive in terms of his attitude towards nuclear weaponry, which of course is germane and relevant today, where we spend close to 100 billion, don't we, on arming ourselves to the hind teeth. Now, suddenly in the context of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, having defensive capabilities might suddenly appear appealing again. But of course, since World War II, have we ever needed them? And do they not potentially make us a target? It's something that we should be debating as a society. And this is something that Hewlett certainly would discuss, because not all countries have nuclear weapons. In fact, very few do. It is more than possible to live in their absence. And of course, in doing so, that means billions could be spent on much more important things like protecting our fragile ecosphere and feeding the poor and providing effective medical care and educating young people. I think would be a much better use of money than it being spent on these horrendous doom machines, because there's no other word for them, really.
By 1958, Johnson began to slow down in his political campaigning. Now 84 years old, his health had begun to seriously deteriorate, and his increasing deafness made public speaking and debate difficult. In 1961, Fisher's term as Archbishop ended, and he was succeeded by Michael Ramsey, with whom Johnson's relationship was much less hostile.
Michael Ramsey, I think, was all right. But it's very important that when Ramsey heard that Noel, Keziah's mother, had died, his chaplain sent us a letter saying that the Archbishop would like to preside over the funeral if we had no objection, as a way of saying, well, it didn't say it as a way of saying sorry, but it's what it meant, as a way the Church and the Archbishop in particular could, as it were, say sorry for the suffering that the family had had at the hands of canons who ought to have known better. And they did. It was awesome, really.
Yes.
The cross of Canterbury was carried in Keziah's mother's funeral, which was a really wonderful moment.
As his political campaigning slowed down in its fervour, Johnson seemingly began to reconsider his previous stances on Soviet foreign policy, commenting during an interview with Jeremy Thorpe in 1962 that he could not condone the invasion of Hungary, although he could understand it.
We discovered those moments, didn't we, with the invasion of Finland, when he seems to question Soviet action. And of course, more recently, we've discovered through talking to Keziah, his daughter, that it sounds as if he was uncomfortable during that moment in 1956 with the Hungarian invasion.
Later that year, Johnson would take a severe fall while working alone in the deanery, fracturing his collarbone. No longer capable of continuing his work, Johnson would resign from his post on December 31st, 1962, and would formally retire as dean in April 1963.
The opposition to him was lethal towards the end. Meetings with the chapter, he'd come back, according to your mother, in absolute state of collapse because they were so horrible. And when he finally retired, they never had a proper party for him. They not only said, "You're going, hooray, you're going." It was a terrible.
Yes, I think I had no idea until I started working myself that when you leave a job, people usually get round and at least have a drink and, say thanks very much, good luck, here's a present, that sort of thing. Nothing of that happened at all when he left Canterbury.
Johnson and his family moved from the deanery to 24 New Street, the name of which he would have legally changed to the Red House with the post office. In 1964, Johnson was invited by Fidel Castro to visit Cuba for the 5th anniversary of Cuba's Independence Day. He met with Castro as well as Che Guevara and learned from them that many Cuban revolutionaries had read his book, The Socialist Sixth of the World. On his 90th birthday, Johnson received a letter of congratulations from Khrushchev, and a celebration was held for him by the British-Soviet Friendship Society. During his retirement, Johnson set to work on writing his autobiography, Searching for Light, with the assistance of Noel and I, who helped him to continue writing even as his health increasingly began to fail him. In 1966, Johnson was admitted to the Kent and Canterbury Hospital with bronchopneumonia and died soon after on the 22nd of October at the age of 92. Hewlett's funeral would be attended by both senior churchmen and Communist Party members alike. While Noel expected that the cathedral would deny him a burial in the cloister garth, the new dean, Ian White Thompson, agreed, and he is buried there today.
I don't know whether many people in Canterbury remember him. Hopefully there are elderly people of our sort of age who do. Very often when Duncan tends to introduce me as the daughter of the Red Dean, and quite often it's met with blank looks, which is fair enough.
Though at the time he was very, very famous. I remember when we announced our engagement, I shall never forget, I was a master at Cranley at the time, and someone came and said, William Hickey's on the phone, who was the big social commentator of the Daily Express. And I said, oh, ha, ha. And he said, no, I'm sorry, this chap says he's William Hickey. And it was, trying to make me say, oh, you're a public school master, you must be a secret fifth columnist, trying to push all sorts of ghastliness at me. And I was reduced to saying over and over again, we're both not political, we're both not political.
The cathedral holds the Red Dean in great affection. I think there's no blindness to the fact that he believed strongly in many things and he acted on those beliefs, and in a few cases he may have some of his beliefs may have been ill-founded, let's say. In particular his strong sort of Soviet communist sympathies. But he sits proudly there with the list of deans. There are many still who remember him, including boy choristers at the time for whom he was a very, very impressive figure. There's a memorial to him here in the cloisters, so he is interred here. So he's very much a Canterbury figure, and the tensions that there were in the time or towards his last years as dean certainly dissipated very quickly. His papers did go to the University of Kent rather than the cathedral, which reflected at that time some tensions between the family and the cathedral. But those tensions dissipated, and certainly members of his family have visited the cathedral recently and regularly. So his name, he's proudly remembered as the Red Dean of Canterbury.
Some people will remember him for sort of idiosyncrasies. Like I remember there was a cafe at Rootham Hill that we used to stop at on our way to London sometimes, and one of the times we stopped there, and there was a little cherry cake, which that's what reminded me, a little cake that he had, which he really liked. And next time we stopped there, I think he said, have you got any more of those little cakes? And she said, yes, we have, and we've got a cherry on them, and we call them the Red Dean. And he loved that sort of story. He loved personal touches.
I think there's a lot that's admirable about him. I think his heart was in the right place. He was a great humanitarian. I think he was a faithful Christian and a good Christian minister. I think he was one of the outstanding deans of Canterbury because he led the cathedral and the city of Canterbury right throughout the Second World War. He was a sort of beacon of leadership and hope and prophecy. Essentially, he was a good man, and essentially he lived a good life. But I think he was just naive. I don't think he realised the extent to which he was being manipulated, particularly by the Kremlin. I think they used him. I think it was Lenin who used the phrase useful fools to describe people in the West who fell in love with communism. and who were useful in the Soviet era as propagandist voices in the West. But they were never sort of accepted or loved. They were always seen as fools. And I think Hewlett-Johnson fell into that category. He was in love. It was a love affair. And his love affair wasn't really with people, it was with ideas. It was with the idea of communism. And so when the Russians invited him over on many occasions, on lavish, all expenses paid tours of Russia, and they fed him endless propaganda material, most of which was completely untrue. And he just swallowed it hook, line and sinker and passed it on to the British people. So there is this fundamental contradiction of basically a good man, a good priest and a good dean, but unbelievably naive and trusting. He saw only what he wanted to see. And in that sense, I think he was an incomplete personality.
One of the important things was that he liked people enormously. He always wanted to see the best in them, whether or not his political views were the same. He was very tolerant. One of my mother's other brothers was a doctor, a psychiatrist. He was also homosexual. He'd had a very bad time with bullying at school, one thing and another. He became mentally ill. He got on with my father well. My father was really tolerant of him. I think that's one of the things I remember about my father, his tolerance of things like homosexuality, mental illness, which today we're hoping that we can take more for granted. But tolerance at that time was much more difficult.
What the Dean really does present is a puzzle. And what he really does show us is that in an age where we tend to see someone as good or bad sometimes wrongly, he does present this very blurred grey image of very humble morality and focus on human rights, yet this complete ignorance of the abuse of such rights in parts of the world in his role as that propagandist. So for me, that puzzle aspect was what kind of still interests me 3-4 years later.
But I do remember him sitting on a chair overlooking the Wye Valley and the Wye Hills later on that day. And Cassard's family couldn't have been more welcoming to me, although I came from another planet in some ways. And there was the Dean sitting in a chair looking out over the view with an enormous bowl of what was known as deanery trifle, which Noel had made. And he sat there with this huge bowl of trifle on his lap, looking very happy and contented. That's my happiest moment.
No, he was a good father and a good husband, and a good man, even if mistaken at times. And I'm very thrilled that he's remembered here.
To be honest, I think you and this school now is the legacy. Okay, we could say Templeman Library, UKC. That's obviously where being used as a repository. But yeah, he's just still absent. I think that term cancel culture is appropriate or applies, doesn't it, to some extent? Obviously not a terminology that was employed even 10 years ago. But yes, he's missing from the historical record. And even though, as we said, we've got this wonderful archive up at UKC, it's not really being accessed. We've come across, haven't we, there's one American PhD student, Professor Butler. Other than that, it's kind of Langton students who access it. So yeah, even from a local level, he's missing, he's absent, let alone nationally, let alone regionally and internationally. There's seemingly no legacy. So I think, this in part documentary can be testimony to him, and perhaps he's someone who might be revised and reevaluated, particularly if we look at his work in, as we just mentioned, critiquing nuclear proliferation, and his attitude in terms of gender and women's rights, and his attitude towards race relations and anti-colonialism. I think he does deserve to be remembered. But equally, we shouldn't forget and we shouldn't gloss over his support for Stalin, which obviously is hugely problematic and in large part obviously explains why he's been forgotten. But I wonder in the post-Cold War world whether that's more viable. I can certainly see why he would have been forgotten up until the 1990s, and maybe now that the archive's there and accessible, over the next 100 years we might see him written back into history books, because he is clearly a seminal figure in 20th century history, which is testified to by, well, there's countless photos and archive material that draws out his relationship with the likes of a Castro and an Eleanor Roosevelt and a Gandhi and a W.E.B. Du Bois and Charlie Chaplin, all these luminaries, these giants of the 20th century. He shared platforms with them. And therefore you'd assume his story would and should be told, even as a cursory tale of not to become, or to be more cynical and to ask questions. That's how we can look at his naive support for the Soviet Union, that none of us should blindly follow any ideology. We should ask difficult questions. And I think that's relevant not just to the left, but to the right, particularly as we can see kind of creeping fascism, with things like our current spy ops bill and policing bills that are going to very much limit our freedom to protest. We need to be asking cynical questions, left or right, about our leaders, about our ideologues, etc.
And how would you like him for him to be remembered?
I think as a good man who fought for what he believed. His mistakes, his beliefs may have been mistaken, but he genuinely tried to do good. Sincere Christian belief and commitment to the church, looking for the best in others. I think the thing that I can best illustrate it is with, again, going back to John Butler's book, a friend of ours, Lois Lang Sims, who knew him very well for a long time. And she finishes the foreword to the book by saying Noel was immensely loyal and supported Hewlett to the end. But after his death in 1966, she said to a long-standing family friend, Lois Lang Sims, "I do wonder if Hewlett and I did make mistakes." And Lois replied, "Noel, you and the Dean worked for what you believed to be the truth, and none of us can do more than that." So I think that's a good epitaph.